"Ma'am, put your hands behind your back." The command cut through the warm afternoon air so sharply that several people on the sidewalk stopped walking and turned their heads at once. Jasmine Carter squeezed her bicycle brakes and slowly rolled to a stop beside the curb, her front tire crunching against loose gravel near the edge of the road. For a brief second, the entire street seemed to hold its breath. Cars continued moving through the intersection half a block away, but here, in front of a small coffee shop and a family-owned hardware store, everything felt frozen. Jasmine glanced over her shoulder and saw 3 police vehicles positioned behind her. Their flashing lights reflected across the windows of nearby businesses, painting streaks of red and blue across the glass. A few pedestrians immediately reached for their phones. Others simply watched in silence. Jasmine carefully placed one foot on the pavement and steadied her bike. Her heartbeat remained calm. Her breathing stayed even. She had learned long ago that panic rarely solved anything. One officer stepped forward while another remained near a patrol vehicle, speaking quietly into a shoulder radio. The taller officer's expression was firm and suspicious, as though he had already decided exactly who Jasmine was before saying another word. "Hands where I can see them," he said. Jasmine slowly lifted both hands away from the handlebars. "Of course, officer," she replied. Her voice was steady and respectful. The officer seemed almost surprised by how calm she sounded. The afternoon sun hung low over the city, casting long shadows across the pavement. Sweat glistened on the necks of people gathered nearby, but Jasmine looked completely composed. At 34 years old, she carried herself with a quiet confidence that didn't demand attention, yet somehow attracted it. She wore a faded gray windbreaker, dark athletic pants, and a small backpack secured tightly across her shoulders. Nothing about her appearance suggested danger. Nothing about her behavior suggested confrontation. Yet the tension surrounding her continued to grow. A mother walking with her young son paused near a bus stop. 2 construction workers stood beside a pickup truck, watching carefully. Even the barista inside the coffee shop had stopped wiping tables and moved closer to the window. Officer Ryan Mercer took another step forward. "We received a report," he said. "Need you to cooperate." Jasmine nodded politely. "I understand." She did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She simply stood beside her bicycle while the summer breeze tugged gently at loose strands of hair near her face. As she shifted slightly, the collar of her jacket moved just enough to reveal something hidden beneath it. A thin metal chain. Attached to it was a worn military dog tag resting quietly against her chest before disappearing beneath the fabric again. No one seemed to notice. Not the officers. Not the crowd. Not even the teenager recording from across the street. Jasmine's eyes briefly moved across the scene surrounding her. The flashing lights, the gathering crowd, the growing whispers. Then her attention returned to the officers. There was no fear in her expression, no anger, only patience. Because while everyone else saw a black woman stopped on a bicycle, Jasmine Carter understood something they didn't. The next few minutes were about to change the entire story. Jasmine Carter had never liked attention. That was one of the reasons she preferred riding her bicycle through the city instead of driving. A bicycle attracted less notice, less conversation, less complication. Most afternoons followed the same quiet rhythm. She finished work, packed her things, and headed home through familiar streets lined with brick storefronts, neighborhood churches, and rows of maple trees that cast long shadows across the sidewalks. Her life looked ordinary from the outside, and that was exactly how she wanted it. Officer Mercer studied her for several seconds while another officer walked around the bicycle, inspecting it as though it held answers to questions no one had asked aloud. Jasmine remained still. The metal frame of the bike reflected the flashing patrol lights, creating brief streaks of color across the pavement. Nearby, people continued gathering. A delivery driver leaned against his van. A retired couple paused their evening walk. More phones appeared. More whispers spread. Yet Jasmine seemed detached from all of it. Years earlier, she had learned how quickly a crowd could form around uncertainty. She had learned that calm was contagious, but so was fear. The choice between them often determined how a situation unfolded. Her gaze drifted momentarily toward the opposite side of the street. A small American flag hung from the front porch of a bakery. The fabric moved gently in the breeze. Something about it brought back memories she rarely allowed herself to revisit. Before becoming a rehabilitation specialist for veterans, Before settling into a quiet apartment on the edge of town, Jasmine had spent more than a decade serving her country. She remembered long mornings before sunrise, boots striking pavement in perfect rhythm, instructors demanding excellence when exhaustion felt overwhelming. She remembered learning discipline, patience, and responsibility. Most of all, she remembered being taught that character revealed itself during moments of pressure, not comfort. Those lessons had stayed with her long after the uniform was gone. The bicycle she rode today had once belonged to another veteran she helped during physical therapy. When he no longer needed it, he insisted she take it. Jasmine had repaired it herself, replacing worn parts and repainting sections of the frame over several weekends. To most people, it looked old. To her, it represented resilience. A second officer approached Mercer and quietly said something near his shoulder. Mercer frowned. Whatever information he received appeared to deepen his suspicion rather than ease it. Jasmine noticed the change immediately. She had spent enough years reading expressions to recognize when someone was searching for confirmation instead of truth. "How long have you lived around here?" Mercer asked. "Almost 4 years," Jasmine answered. "And where are you coming from today?" "Work." His eyes narrowed slightly. "What kind of work?" "I help military veterans recover from injuries and adapt to civilian life." The answer seemed to catch him off guard, though only briefly. Around them, the afternoon sunlight continued fading toward evening. The air smelled faintly of fresh asphalt and coffee drifting from the nearby shop. Somewhere in the distance, a train horn echoed across the city. Jasmine stood quietly beside her bicycle while conversations murmured through the growing crowd. Hidden beneath her jacket, the dog tag rested against her chest, cool and familiar. Few people knew her story. Fewer still knew what she had experienced. But as Officer Mercer continued studying her with visible doubt, Jasmine sensed that the assumptions shaping this encounter were about to collide with a reality none of them expected. Officer Ryan Mercer folded his arms and looked past Jasmine toward the growing crowd gathering along the sidewalk. The attention clearly irritated him. What should have been a routine stop was turning into something much larger, and every new phone pointed in his direction seemed to make his expression harder. Jasmine noticed it, but said nothing. She had spent enough years around authority figures to recognize the difference between confidence and pride. One was steady. The other became fragile when questioned. Across the street, a city bus slowed near the corner, and several passengers turned their heads toward the flashing lights. A few pressed against the windows to see what was happening. The entire block seemed caught in a strange pause. Mercer glanced toward the second officer. "Run it again," he said quietly. The officer nodded and returned to his patrol vehicle. Jasmine remained beside her bicycle, one hand resting lightly on the handlebar. She could feel dozens of eyes watching her, waiting to see what would happen next. Most people expected tension. Some expected an argument. Instead, they saw a woman standing calmly in the middle of unwanted attention. The contrast made the situation feel even more unusual. Mercer studied her again. "You seem awfully relaxed." Jasmine gave a small nod. Being calm usually helps. His jaw tightened slightly. "Most people get nervous. Most situations are different." The answer was respectful, but it did not satisfy him. Nearby, a young boy standing beside his mother tugged gently on her sleeve. He could not have been older than 8. His eyes moved between the officers and Jasmine with visible concern. Jasmine noticed him immediately. Years of working with injured veterans had taught her to recognize fear before it was spoken aloud. She offered the child a brief, reassuring smile. Nothing dramatic, nothing exaggerated, just enough to tell him everything was going to be okay. The boy relaxed almost instantly. His mother seemed surprised. Mercer noticed the exchange and followed Jasmine's gaze. For a moment, the officer appeared uncertain. It was difficult to reconcile the woman calmly comforting a nervous child with the image he seemed determined to maintain in his mind. The radio attached to his shoulder suddenly crackled with static. A voice spoke. Mercer listened carefully, his expression unreadable. When the transmission ended, he asked another question. "You said you work with veterans. How long?" "Almost 6 years. And before that?" Jasmine looked toward the evening sky for a brief second. The sunlight reflected off the glass windows surrounding the intersection, bathing everything in warm gold. "I served." The answer was simple. Mercer waited. "Served where?" Jasmine met his eyes. "Where I was needed." Several people nearby exchanged glances. The response sounded humble rather than evasive, but it raised more questions than it answered. The officer who had returned to the patrol vehicle suddenly stepped out again, holding a tablet. He walked quickly toward Mercer. Something on the screen had captured his attention. The officer leaned close and whispered a few words. Jasmine could not hear them, but she saw the immediate reaction. Mercer blinked once, then twice. The certainty that had defined his posture since the beginning seemed to shift ever so slightly. For the first time since the stop began, doubt entered the conversation. Officer Mercer took the tablet from his partner and stared at the screen longer than anyone expected. The crowd noticed the change immediately. Moments earlier, he had carried himself with the certainty of a man convinced he already knew the ending of the story. Now there was hesitation. Small, almost invisible, but unmistakable. Jasmine remained exactly where she was. The bicycle stood beside her. The evening breeze moved gently through the trees lining the street. Somewhere nearby, a wind chime rang softly from the porch of an old brick house. The ordinary sounds of the neighborhood continued, yet the atmosphere around the flashing patrol cars felt increasingly tense. Mercer lowered the tablet slightly and looked at Jasmine again. "You never mentioned your military background." Jasmine's expression remained calm. "You never asked." Several people in the crowd exchanged glances. The answer was simple, respectful, yet it landed with surprising weight. Mercer seemed frustrated by it. He handed the tablet back to the other officer and stepped closer, not aggressively, not threateningly, but with the posture of someone unwilling to let go of a conclusion he had already formed. "You understand why we are asking questions?" Jasmine nodded. "I understand that you received information and are doing your job." "Then help me understand something." Mercer gestured toward the bicycle. "Most people with your qualifications are not riding around town on an old bike." A few people nearby frowned at the comment. Jasmine simply rested a hand on the handlebar. "Most people define success differently." Mercer said nothing. The answer clearly was not what he expected. Jasmine glanced briefly at the bicycle. The paint showed signs of age. A few scratches caught the fading sunlight. The front basket carried a canvas bag filled with paperwork from the Veteran Rehabilitation Center where she worked. Nothing about it looked impressive, but appearances had never mattered much to her. "A veteran I helped recover gave me this bicycle years ago," she said. "He told me it reminded him that moving forward mattered more than moving fast." The crowd grew quieter. Even the officers seemed to listen. Jasmine continued. "I kept it because it reminds me of him." For the first time since the stop began, the conversation felt human rather than procedural. Yet Mercer still appeared unsettled. He folded his arms and glanced toward the people recording with their phones. The attention clearly bothered him. The situation was slipping away from the version he had imagined when his patrol cars first pulled up behind Jasmine. Suddenly, a voice called out from the sidewalk. "Excuse me." Everyone turned. The young boy Jasmine had smiled at earlier stood beside his mother. He looked nervous, but determined. "She has been nice this whole time," he said quietly. "She has not done anything wrong." His mother looked embarrassed and gently touched his shoulder, but the boy continued. She even smiled when everybody else looked scared. An uncomfortable silence followed. Mercer looked away. Jasmine offered the child another small smile. Warm, grateful, nothing more. The boy smiled back. Across the street, more people had gathered. Some whispered among themselves. Others simply watched. The balance of the moment was changing, and deep down, Officer Mercer could feel it. The assumptions that had guided this stop were beginning to crack under the weight of something far more difficult to ignore than suspicion. They were colliding with the truth standing quietly in front of him. The truth standing quietly in front of him should have ended the situation. Instead, it seemed to make Officer Mercer even more determined to regain control of it. He glanced at the gathering crowd, then at the patrol vehicles, then back at Jasmine. The uncertainty on his face lasted only a moment before pride pushed it aside. "We are not finished here," he said. The words hung in the air. Jasmine nodded calmly. "I understand." Her patience somehow made the tension worse. People expected arguments when pressure increased. They expected raised voices, frustration, or resistance. What they were witnessing instead was a woman who refused to become the version of herself that others seemed eager to imagine. The evening light continued fading across the street. Storefront windows glowed with reflections of amber sunlight and flashing emergency lights. Somewhere behind the crowd, a church bell rang the hour. The sound drifted softly through the neighborhood before disappearing into the warm summer air. Mercer looked toward his partner. "Check the report again." The officer hesitated. "We already did." Mercer did not answer immediately. His jaw tightened. The silence itself revealed what everyone was beginning to suspect. The original reason for the stop was becoming harder to justify. Jasmine could feel the shift. So could the crowd. Conversations remained hushed, but expressions were changing. People who had arrived expecting certainty now saw confusion. People who had assumed guilt now saw dignity. The difference mattered. Mercer stepped closer and studied Jasmine carefully. "You seem very confident." "Not confident," Jasmine replied. "Just comfortable telling the truth." Several heads turned. A few people nodded quietly. Mercer exhaled through his nose. He was a man accustomed to answers that reinforced his assumptions. Jasmine's answers kept doing the opposite. For the first time, the situation felt less like an investigation and more like a mirror. Every question seemed to reveal something about the person asking it. Nearby, the young boy still stood beside his mother. He had not stopped watching. Neither had the construction workers. Neither had the people holding phones. The crowd was no longer waiting for Jasmine to make a mistake. They were waiting to see whether the officers would recognize one. A radio transmission suddenly crackled from inside one of the patrol vehicles. The second officer walked quickly to listen. Moments later, he returned with a different expression than before. There was no suspicion in it, only concern. He leaned toward Mercer and spoke quietly. This time the conversation lasted longer. Mercer listened without interrupting. His eyes briefly moved toward Jasmine, then back to the officer, then toward the tablet again. The atmosphere changed immediately. People sensed it. Jasmine sensed it. Even the breeze seemed quieter. The officer stepped back. Mercer remained still for several seconds. His shoulders no longer carried the certainty they had at the beginning of the stop. Instead, they carried something heavier. Doubt. The kind that arrives when facts refuse to support conclusions. Jasmine rested one hand on the bicycle seat and waited. She had learned years ago that truth moved at its own pace. Sometimes quickly, sometimes painfully slow, but eventually it arrived. Across the street, another vehicle turned onto the block. It was larger than the others. Dark-colored, official-looking. As it approached, several officers glanced in its direction. Whatever was happening next, everyone could feel it. The story that began with assumptions was moving toward a very different ending.